Hello, my name is Zachariah Parcels from the Crime, Extremism and Terrorism Group at ITSS Verona. And here I'm with Professor Boaz Ganor, a very renowned scholar at Reichman University and the founder of the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism, and whose recent book, The Counter-Terrorism Strategy, Origins to the Present, was featured in the Foreign Affairs magazine. So we are very lucky to have him. And today we are going to be discussing in our ITSS Verona members series the definition of terrorism. So would you like to add anything to my introduction? Any new developments?
No, thank you, Zachariah. For the last 25 years, I'm heading the Institute for Counterterrorism, and I'm dealing with this subject matter for almost 35 years. So it's a pleasure to be with you here, and let's start rolling.
Perfect. So could you please, for our audience, succinctly describe this definition of terrorism that is in various publications that you have?
Yeah, I was mentioning that I'm in the field of counterterrorism and the research of counterterrorism for more than 35 years. And I think that the first article I ever wrote was on the definition of terrorism. And actually, it was on the need to adopt an international definition of terrorism, which was a very debatable subject. Most of the scholars back then and actually today, the vast majority of the scholars would argue that it's impossible to reach an agreement on a definition of terrorism. This is too politically biased phenomenon. It's a subjective term. Everybody use or misuse the definition for their purposes. If you attack my enemy, you're a freedom fighter. If you fight against me, you're a terrorist, although you do the same atrocities or things altogether. And we all know the saying, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, which seems to be quite accurate and implies that this is a subjective term. And I beg to differ. I beg to differ back then, 35 years ago, and I beg to differ today. I tend to believe that A, it's possible to reach an agreement on the definition of terrorism, and B, it's necessary to reach an agreement for that definition. Let's start with the necessary, and then maybe we'll talk about the possibility. It's necessary because without that, the level of international cooperation would be limited. You would have a glass ceiling for the level of cooperation because probably, the CIA doesn't need to agree on the exact same definition with the Israeli Mossad in order to cooperate with them. I presume it's good enough. Cooperation even without agreeing on one definition. But when we analyze all the circles around the core phenomenon of terrorism, incitement for terrorism, terrorism funds, how can one fight effectively against the incitement for terrorism when you have the inciter living in one country and working in one country, using an internet platform which is controlled by another country, and use the platform in order to incite people in other countries altogether? If we do not agree, all those countries together, on what is terrorism, what is the definition of terrorism, how can we fight all together against incitement of terrorism? That's, of course, impossible. Same thing about the money trail of terrorist organizations and so many other fields altogether. Even if you have good intentions of all the actors and all the states would like to cooperate, once you don't have an acceptable agreement on one international objective definition, it's impossible to reach that. So once you are persuaded, and I was persuaded 35 years ago, that there is a need for a definition, then the effort should be in finding the best definition possible. And to give you one hint about how to reach that definition, I would say that as short and precise the definition is, it's more effective. And when I see definitions of terrorism, and unfortunately I see it on a regular basis, that holds many articles, holds a few pages, immediately, even without reading that, I understand that this is not an effective definition. The definition that I use is short, is precise, and I believe it's the most objective definition. It says that terrorism is the deliberate use of violence aimed against civilian targets by non-state actors in order to achieve political ends or political or ideological ends. Now, very briefly, we can zoom in to the elements of the definition, but let me go very briefly on 4 or 5 elements of the definition. It's a use of violence, because if it's not violent activity, this is not terrorism. If you insult somebody, this is not terrorism. But if you use violence, it's terrorism. It could be high level or low level of terrorism, but it's terrorism. Second, it's aimed against civilian targets. And you know, most of the definition that I know that refers to the nature of the targets, that doesn't refer to the term civilian targets. They're talking about non-combatants. I prefer the term civilian targets because many reasons. I might elaborate on that later, but for the time being, let me say, because I think it's the most objective term. It's easier to define who's a civilian and who's not a civilian in any circumstances. Much more difficult to define non-combatants. And I think if you use the term non-combatants, it's kind of unfair towards those who use the violence, because as states believe that they have the right to deliberately attack non-combatant terrorists, meaning terrorists not just when they're in the battlefield, but also when they are, I don't know, in their training bases, the same reciprocal right, I believe, need to be given to the other side as well. So that's why I use the term civilians and not non-combatants. The third element is the non-state actor. It's being conducted by non-state actor. One would argue, why is that? Are states necessarily more moral than organizations? And the answer, of course, not. States might be less moral and might conduct bigger atrocities than non-state actors. But when states deliberately attack civilians, this is already has been defined by the international humanitarian law as war crimes or crimes against humanity. From my point of view, terrorism is the equivalent of war crime or crimes against humanity that refers to the states, and here we refer to non-state actors. And the last element is what are they trying to achieve? The political or the ideological goal, because that's what differs between terrorism to say a regular so-called criminal activity, because criminals are doing exactly what terrorists are doing. They kill, they arson, they extort, and all of the above, but they're not being motivated by ideological or political grievances. If you are being motivated by those grievances, you are a terrorist and not a criminal. Why do we differ? Because it poses a greater risk to the safety of states and communities and security of the whole world. If you're being motivated just by profit, as organized crime is, it's a danger, but it's not as dangerous as those which are being motivated by extreme ideology or extreme political goals that they're trying to achieve.
Perfect. That is extremely, extremely helpful. And that also brings me to another question with regards to state intervention and how can we demarcate between the state sponsorship of terrorism and the state intervention in terrorism, because we know how complex the situation, particularly in situations like Syria, can become. So how can we, as say, policymakers, but also academics, try to delineate between the state intervention and state sponsorship of terrorism?
It's a very good question, and I'll share with you my views on that. I created some kind of a typology, if you wish. Think about a pyramid in order to understand my argument now. And I would say that there are different levels in the pyramid of possible involvement of states in terrorist activity. Although I said terrorism is being conducted by non-state actors, but states are involved in terrorism for sure. At the lowest level of the pyramid, the baseline of the pyramid, it's the level in which states are sponsoring terrorism. They support terrorist organizations or individuals or networks. They give them ideological support. They give them monetary support. They give them military support. They give them operational support. All of those are different stages within the different stages of the pyramid that we described. All in all, the involvement of states in those types of activities would be regarded or defined, if you wish, as state sponsorship for terrorism. But there is a higher level than that. And the higher level than that, a higher level of involvement of states in terrorism, is when the state is involved not just in supporting, but also in initiating the attacks. We have many cases in the history and in recent times in which states like Syria, Libya, and definitely Iran initiate terrorist activity that was conducted by proxies. If it's Iran, it could be Hezbollah. If it was Libya or Syria, it was PFLP-GC, Jibril Front, and other organizations altogether. In that case, the state is interested in a certain attack in order to stress something, in order to threaten some targets, in order to achieve some goals in the international relations that they are trying to achieve. And they use their proxies for that purpose of activity. The definition that I would use for this type of involvement of states is states initiating terrorism. We had states sponsoring terrorism. Now we have states initiating terrorism. But there is even a higher level of that. That's the tip of the pyramid. And that's when the state is conducting terrorist activity with their own governmental apparatuses. If we take Iran for that purpose, it could be that those attacks would be conducted by the intelligence agency, the Ministry of Intelligence, or by Al-Quds Force, Revolutionary Guard, and so on and so forth. We saw attacks of that sort that have been conducted on European soil when the Iranian authorities wanted to kill and to harm Iranian dissidents that are living in Europe. We saw it in Germany, we saw it in France, we saw it in other places altogether. This is the closest thing of state terrorism, but I don't call that as state terrorism. I refer to that as state conducting terrorism, because when states are involved in this type of activity, it's either, again, a war crime or a crime against humanity. And I prefer to use those terms which are widely accepted in the international community and the international humanitarian law in order to describe this type of activity of states. Since I'm talking about a pyramid, you can imagine that as we climb in the steps at the ladder of the pyramid, you see less and less involvement of states in this type of activity. The tip of the iceberg, the tip of the pyramid, which is state conducting terrorism, there are very, very few cases that actually fits to that definition. Much more case studies you would find at the lowest level of the pyramid of states' involvement, monetary sponsoring, military sponsoring of terrorist organizations.
To go and continue with that same thought about state involvement in terrorism, but also the lower levels, as you talked about, with the state sponsorship of terrorism, there is a whole swath of literature about proxy wars. And you use the word proxy yourself in the definition of state sponsorship versus state intervention of initiation of terrorism. So how could we, or is it conceptually useful to delineate between state sponsorship and proxy war doctrine?
It's a great question. And it goes back to what we discussed before, to the definition of terrorism. Because when you talk about states' proxies or the use of proxies by states, it's not necessarily just for terrorism purposes, because states might and actually are using proxies for insurgency, for guerrilla warfare, which is not terrorism. That's deliberate use of violence aimed against military targets of their enemies. Okay, if Iran is using Shiite militias to attack the military of Saudi Arabia, that's insurgency or guerrilla warfare, and that's definitely a proxy war. But it's not terrorism. If they use them in order to bomb a coffee house or to blow up a bus, a civilian bus in the midst of a city, that's proxies which are used for terrorist activities or using proxies for terrorism. altogether. Practically, states might use proxies for activities which are not necessarily even violent activity in order to promote their diplomatic or political interests in a different, it could be subversive activity, which is not violent activity as well. So there is a whole variety of states' use or misuse of proxies to promote their purposes. Only one niche would be when they use them in order to promote terrorism under the definition that I use.
Okay, perfect. Well, I think that's all the questions I have for today. Of course, the questions would be endless on this topic. It is beyond interesting, and especially with the necessity of the definition of terrorism, defining and delineating between terrorism and guerrilla warfare, as you touched on at the end, and also kind of demarcating between this terrorism definition and terrorism literature and that of proxy war literature. So we very appreciate your time and your efforts, and also all of your contributions to the security and terrorism field. And on behalf of ITSS as well, I very much like to thank you again for your time.
Thank you for having me, and actually thank you for the very good work that you do in your organization. So thanks again.
Thank you very much.